Inference is about to go up 1,000,000x. Not 1,000x, not 1,000,000x, 1,000,000,000x. And the guy who's making it go up 1,000,000x is here with us today. Tuhin, thank you so much for joining us. Please join us. Thank you. Tuhin, founder and CEO of Baseten. You've had a long scenic journey to the day here today. Lots of windy turns. Tell us about it. You know, a lot of students in the class who want to be entrepreneurs, I think we'll find inspiration in the journey.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for having me. It's really nice to meet you all. My name's Tuhin. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of Baseten. Baseten's about 7 years old. I've been working in technology since 2012. I'm originally from Sydney, Australia. I came here for uni. Actually started my career in finance. So I moved home after uni to work at an Australian investment bank called Macquarie. In my first day over there, they said, "You want to move to New York and work on privatizing toll roads and airports?" So I moved to New York and I worked in privatizing toll roads and airports. And about 2 years in, I was bored out of my mind, and I decided that I should go back to engineering, which I'd studied in undergrad. And I moved to Boston to work on doing some research for machine learning. This is 2012 or 2013. No, 2011, 2012. And what we were doing is we were using traditional machine learning techniques to track the prognosis of neuromuscular disease. Mm-hmm. I did that for about a year and a half, put out some papers, and really quickly realized that if I was going to do machine learning, even back then, that I probably should be in San Francisco. So I moved to San Francisco and got involved in early stage technology as an engineer. I think probably the more important piece is I kind of fell in love with early stage technology and small teams and building products and where no one really cares. Did that for a few years, started a couple of companies, starting in 2015. They went nowhere, but I had the bug. And so in 2019, me and my two co-founders, a guy called Phil and a guy called Amir, who I'd worked with for the better part of 10 to 15 years. Is that a me thing?
Oh, they're just turning up your volume.
Oh, okay, cool.
Need some more energy.
Yeah, so they, I know these guys for 10 or 15 years, and we had this idea that machine learning was going to be pretty big, and let's build an infrastructure business alongside it to maybe capture the index of it. Obviously, machine learning was a lot bigger than we expected, and it came a lot faster. And so what we've been doing for the last 4 years is production inference, powering the fastest growing AI companies in the world.
Yeah. You have a salivating list of customers. Actually, you had a post, I copied your post here, which is, these are all the founders that Baseten has a good opportunity to work with. You might know some of these faces. Some of them have been here in class. This is probably the best index of AI founders who work with Baseten. And so maybe break it down for us. Pick an example or two of faces up here. When they work with Baseten, what does that mean that they work with Baseten? What's an example of their work with us? And what does that enable for their business and their customers?
Yeah, maybe I'll pick two fun ones. I'll pick Tane, who's on top. I'll pick Tane, who actually went to Stanford. You know Tane.
It's like a brother to me.
Very well. And then I'll pick Shiv. And so they run very different businesses. So Tane runs a company called Whisperflow. I don't know how many people here know Whisperflow.
How many have heard of Whisperflow?
Yeah, awesome. That'd make him very happy. So Whisperflow is basically a text to keyboard, speech to keyboard, speech to text app for voice typing, more or less. They run a lot of custom models that they've built in-house or like modified in-house in a very particular way to make that experience possible. And so what we do for them is we run all the optimizations, we run all the infrastructure so that, that latency from the time that you talk to when text shows up is as quick as possible.
Yeah.
There's language models, there's audio models, there's actually I think 3 or 4 language models in the middle there and 2 audio models to make that happen, and all of them run on Baseten. Shiv, who's also a good friend of mine, is the CEO of a company called Abridge. Abridge is a healthcare, it's an ambient scribe used in almost every healthcare system in the US that's deeply integrated with EMRs. They run about 20 different models, everything from obviously speech to text models to go from what is happening in the patient in the operating room or the patient's room to everything that goes into turning that into a clinical note that is deeply integrated with the EMR. Again, over like dozens of models, lots of requirements from a reliability perspective, from a speed perspective, and I think every single one of those models runs on Baseten. And I think that's kind of emblematic of kind of what we want to do. Our thesis is that AI is going to be absolutely massive. Inference is the cogs of AI value being delivered. And today, about 90% or 95% of spend on inference is going to frontier models, and about 5% is going to custom models. And we believe that the way that all these folks who are building amazing applications with AI are going to build profitable, viable, defensible companies is with custom models, and hopefully they all run on Baseten.
95% of their spend is going to frontier models.
Yeah.
5% is going to open source models.
Or post-trained open source models, yeah.
Got it. Actually, before we go there, I have a question for the 2 businesses that you highlighted. So, Abridge or Whisperflow, both fairly scaled businesses.
Yep.
Why would they come work with you? Why not? Typically, if I was a founder, I would go to my cloud provider. I would go to AWS, GCP, Azure, or one of the neo clouds that are the AI clouds, CoreWeave, Nebius, others. Why Baseten?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to like the 3 or 4 core tenets of like the software we're building. So there's obviously performance. You need these things to work as quickly as possible. If you go to CoreWeave, Nebius, AWS, GCP, you're kind of on your own to do those optimizations. The second piece is reliability and compute. They're coming to us because they need inference to run across clouds in a very fault-tolerant, resilient way. I think, part of that is being multi-cloud and having access to compute from multiple sources. We kind of unlock multi-cloud for them. And the third one is like the developer platform that we provide, which gives them, flexibility, security, observability, and all those good things to make that happen. And so what we actually find is a lot of them do go to those folks you talked about first, and then realize the pain of standing up that whole inference stack on top of compute, and realize that they'll just be better served coming to Baseten.
Fascinating. I imagine now going to the second thing you had said earlier, 95% of them, or 95% of tokens are on Frontier, 5% on post-trained or open source of some kind. If I was using an open source model or post-training an open source model, I am branching off the sort of the lineage of intelligence that might improve, and I run the risk that the next GPT model or the next Opus model, let's call it GPT-6 or Opus 5, will be better than what I just post-trained. Why go through the effort of branching out into this specific model when the no work option might just get there in a couple of weeks or a couple of months?
Yeah, look, there's a number of reasons, I'd say. I'll give you the viable reason. I'll give you the cynical reason. The viable reason, the viability reason here is that if you think about a company, if you think about any company that's doing things with these frontier models, today open source models are about 90 days behind closed source models. And the question that a lot...
Can you give a slide on this? Keep going.
Yeah, do I? Next one. Yeah, open source models are about 90 days behind frontier models, and you can run them about 70 to 90% cheaper.
Wow.
Than frontier models.
70 to 90% cheaper.
Yeah, and especially when you add in a bit of, I think you had Yash in here. last week who probably told you the post-training narrative of
Yeah.
specialized models. And especially when you factor that in, you can really do better, faster, cheaper for these models. And it's really, they come to us from like the viability reason when they really go from I have product market fit to I need to become a scaled business and figure out how to, get my gross margins, up from 0 all the way to 40, 50, 60, 70%, hopefully, like you want to be. The cynical reason I'd say, which is, look, what do you have that is defensible against a frontier model? It's probably some workflow, some user signal that only you have. If you keep working with the frontier labs, to some extent, you're going to give them all the data and all that user signal, and they're going to I was talking to a prominent public company CEO. I won't say who it was. He likened the frontier labs to the East India Company.
The East India Company.
They show up in India and they're making all these partnerships, but really what they're doing is you're giving them all the tricks on how to rule that. And before you know, their post-training models kind of at, against those workflows that are sacred to you, that only you know. So to be defensible against this and keep the thing that makes you special, you need you need to own your intelligence to some extent, and that's why they are figuring out how they can use open source models and post-train them. And really kind of build up that stack themselves to own their intelligence.
Fascinating. Taking this further, Tuhin, it seems that if I had a larger volume of workloads, I am more incentivized to move to open source or post-trained model. You have a couple of customers that are very scaled customers, Abridge, Whisperflow, Cursor, etc. They are obviously very large customers of the frontier models. Is it also the case that the larger or the more user base you have, the more likely you are to adopt this? Or is it the other way, is like the smaller guys are more likely to adopt this?
I think the former. I think the larger you are, the more existential it becomes.
Right.
To be able to need to go towards this. Because I think that's when the bigger you get, the more I mean, you can talk about this as well, but you look at these businesses, and as you get to massive scale, if you're just trading tokens, it starts becoming very, very expensive, and the more capital you need, and I think you need that path to profitability. This post-trading becomes very important there.
Yeah, I mean, the leading coding companies that are not the frontier model companies themselves are still rumored to be negative gross margin. And so I imagine it is existential for them to be a viable business, to shift that token volume towards open source. Now, is there a performance gap that they notice as they move from, let's say, for example, Cursor using Anthropic's models or GPT-5, the latest OpenAI models, to moving to a post-trained model like they did recently? There was a lot of hoopla on Twitter about their work with Composer. Does the performance take a hit? Is there a way that the workload partitions that it does not, or how do the users experience the change in the underlying, almost the engine of the Ferrari was swapped out?
Yeah, well, we don't have any any data for, internally, but I think you would hope that it gets better, right? You'd hope that as they post-train models to user signals that they have, the experience of the user gets better, and hopefully it also drives both performance from a latency perspective and reliability perspective higher, because there's a lot more control.
Got it. Makes a ton of sense. And what is the business of Baseten? How do we monetize our users? Obviously there's a whole slew of pricing options right now in AI. You've got outcome-based pricing, token-based pricing, GPU by the hour pricing, and others that I might not even know about. Where do we fit in, and how does that work with your largest customers?
Yeah, look, right now we mark up compute. We're relative for the most part. So what that means is that you come to use Baseten, you bring your models, you load it up onto the Baseten inference stack, and you basically choose which compute you want to run it on. And a Baseten H100 or Baseten B200 is more expensive than a raw B200. I think what's interesting there to think about, how much it is an expensive way to get raw compute, but ideally that's the value you're getting in the software stack. Others use token pricing. We have some customers, and we are pretty relatively unsophisticated about this today. But we're moving towards a world, especially as we unlock more of those post-training workflows within Baseten itself, where the narrative changes from how much are you paying for compute to how much you're paying per token. And actually the app layer companies appreciate that a bit more, because especially for those coming from using Anthropic or OpenAI, they have a like for like and how much cost savings there are.
Fascinating. I might follow up on something you said. You said post-training workflows.
Yeah.
Could you simplify that for us? What does a post-training workflow look like, start to end? And feel free to take an example if you can. How does it work? How does it work with Baseten, or how does it work with or a large customer like Cursor or Bridge or Whisperflow?
Yeah, we talk a bit about post-training there.
Right here,
yeah. So we have training, and so really what you're doing as a customer there is you're designing what your utility function is, and you're saying, hey, this is the thing that I want to optimize with this given model. So you need to define that. We can't help you there. We don't know your product. We don't know your users. We don't know what you're optimizing for in your business. So instead, you decide what the utility function is, and then once you know that, start giving us a bunch of data and choose an open source model. And we're going to give you all the scaffolding to turn that into a post-trained model. And then once you have that, how does that roll into the inference piece? And so we kind of own that entire loop. So you bring your data, you bring your utility function, you choose a base model. So you might say, maybe just to make it very concrete, you might say, let's say you're building a speech-to-text model for a medical use case. You choose, maybe it is errors or transcription errors, the thing you're trying to minimize. So that's your utility function. You choose the model you want to use. So let's say you could use a Kimi K25, and then you give us a data set. We have all that scaffolding set up to turn that into a very, very good post-trained Kimi K25 made for that. And then we obviously have all the integration into inference predefined. And so our customers who are coming to us with that, and I think you're going to see more and more of this, really, they come with data and what they know about their model, about their workflows, and they leave with a post-trained, specialized model running on Baseten.
They trust you with all that data, the keys to the kingdom.
Yeah.
Is that a natural conversation for them to hand over the keys to the kingdom to Baseten or the East India Company?
We're
the West India Company.
We're the West. We're good. We're the rebellion.
Right.
We're trying to arm the rebellion. So, is that a natural conversation? I think it's fine. I think most people are okay with it. I think we have a track record of working with amazing companies, and the brand kind of does a lot of work there. But we also have incredibly intense security posture internally.
Right.
And we work with multiple competitors, and we have access to their models and their data. And we have set up the boundaries internally to make sure that there's no leakage between that. And so, is it natural? I think it's not as bad as you'd think. You also got to remember that a lot of these companies are trying to move very, very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And I think they're more interested on, can you solve their user problem, as opposed to we need to do everything from scratch. I think there's a lot of trust they put in Baseten, but I think hopefully that's earned and from all the great customers we work with and their friends who are already using us for a lot of these things.
Makes sense. The other big bet you guys are making implicitly is that open source will stay on the frontier for at least 3 to 6 months behind the frontier. The economic model of open source frontier labs
Yeah.
is TBD.
TBD. I was about to say TBD. Yeah.
Is not known, and there's a lot of at least Western open source labs, like obviously Meta has decided to in-source or not open source their latest models anymore. Talk about that for a second. What is the business model of open source? What is your best guess of how the world unfolds? Because that is obviously one of the biggest underlying bets that you've made.
Yeah. Look, I think the two big bets of Baseten are the existence of an independent application layer.
Yeah.
And will open source be good enough that you can continue to post-train? Most of America so far has shown that it is not able to produce the best in class, at least in the last 2 years, open source models. Like the best open source models today are coming.
That's wild.
From China. I think.
Why is that?
Why can't they produce them?
Why can't America produce open source models that are performant?
I mean, I think all the best research in the world right now work at two companies, and they don't think they're, despite their names maybe suggesting otherwise, they're not super motivated to produce that. I think.
And why have the non-American researchers decided to pursue the open source model?
I mean, I think it's to be relevant probably to start with, right? Like we think like Moonshot and Alibaba and Minimax, there's just a market opportunity to take the counter position of closed models. And Meta did that too, right? A few years ago, and then they famously have swung the other way.
Yeah.
Look, we open source models need to exist. Like I think it's somewhat of a matter of national security if America does not have good open source models, or if the cost of intelligence is 70 or 90% cheaper in the East than it is the West. Like that,
Right.
That's probably not a good outcome.
Yeah.
I do think the best American companies are actually pretty well aligned around open source. Google produced Gemma. NVIDIA's putting a lot of investment into the Nemotron family. Reflection AI, hopefully will come out with a good open source model in a few years from now. I think it's inevitability though. Realistically, if we're in a world in 10 years from now where there's no good open source models, that's probably a very bad thing,
Right.
For the US. But I do believe there's enough investment happening that it's going to happen.
Did you? I'm sure you did. Anthropic put out a big post this morning.
I saw that.
The future of the Chinese and American AI relationship, of course, very beneficial for Anthropic. Any thoughts on that? Actually, maybe summarize the post for the class. So how do you read that?
I haven't read it. I've been back to back this morning, but my read on it was like there's two scenarios that that America's at the frontier, and the other one is that China is neck and neck, more or less. And I think, and again, maybe you've read it.
No, that's exactly it. They basically said we lead it and you shut it down, or we are neck and neck, and that's a war.
Yeah, and their recommendation was let's shut it down. So there's not a war.
That's right.
Look, they're awesome and they do amazing work. I think it's, I genuinely believe in life. Before you make any points, you should make your biases and your incentive functions very clear. I don't think they acknowledge that. Look, I don't know what to make of that. I also just don't. I just think we put out a post yesterday about the world of many models. We think intelligence shouldn't be owned by two people. I think in the history of time, when too much power has been concentrated in one or two parties, bad things generally have happened. And I also just don't believe the thesis to some extent that these two companies with a massive profit motive should be the arbiters of morality for the rest of us. When I think about do I think that it is concerning that all the best open source models are coming from China? 100%. And they're great. We've spent time with all those teams and they're amazing. It's not so much that I don't trust them. I just think that America should have great open source as well.
Yeah. It seems. Do you think the velocity of American open source is increasing or decreasing over time in terms of talent and resources, capital, GPUs?
Yeah. I think up until like a year ago, it was definitely decreasing.
Okay.
But I think there's an uptick now. I think some very, very important companies are behind this. And I think we'll see a lot this year going the other way.
Yeah.
And I think it's necessary because otherwise we're just going to have two companies left.
Right.
There'll be no app layer.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Switching gears a little bit, Tuhin, you are in a very advantaged position where you see a lot of different hardware that you run inference on, right? Well, actually, you run at 2 layers, a lot of different providers. Actually, I think you had this map, which we can talk about for a second. But I actually meant a layer underneath this. I assume a lot of the inference that you guys are delivering is on NVIDIA hardware, just because it's the most
majority,
prevalent.
Yeah.
But then there's a long tail. Obviously, Trainium announced in the last earnings call they had about $20 billion of revenue run rate. TPU, I'm sure, is a big number.
Yeah.
We don't know what it is. They haven't disclosed it, at least. Then there's Cerebras from this morning.
Yeah.
Then there's everybody else, Etched, Maddox, Positron, others that we do not know about, D-Matrix, Samba Nova, etc. Talk about the heterogeneous compute ecosystem. How do you see the world unfolding on the hardware side?
Yeah. Look, we are like I think in general diversity. Like I can't sit here and say that I believe in a world of many models and then say, oh, only one chip will exist. That'd be hypocritical. But that being said, we run the majority of our fleet on NVIDIA chips. Like TPUs are very promising. Obviously, all the new age, the Neo chips, if you want to call them that, are very promising. We haven't seen anyone really use Trainium at scale. I think the advantage you have with NVIDIA is just obviously a fleshed out supply chain.
Yeah.
A fleshed out supply chain. With a very, very low cost of capital and a very strong relationship with TSMC.
Yeah.
I think that the idea that anyone else can really compete with that today is somewhat fanciful.
Yeah.
To go one layer deeper, like one thing we rely very, very heavily on is CUDA and the developer ecosystem around CUDA. There's nothing like CUDA. CUDA is insane. I think, these new architectures are breaking out. Inference has like 2 core parts to it, which is one is prefill and one's decode. This idea that all this will also just run on one chip, which is historically what's happened, probably isn't the end state. But NVIDIA acquired Grok. A lot of these new chips you're talking about is trying to separate out these concerns and
prefill and
decode and where you do the memory bound stuff all on the GPUs and you do the compute bound stuff on a different chip. So like separating out. So I think that is the world will go, like heterogeneous architectures for these things. I think right now for us as a company, we're just trying to move as fast as possible and our customers are trying to move as fast as possible. And CUDA, availability of NVIDIA GPUs, the ability to use stuff like TRT-LLM, which is clearly just built for NVIDIA chips.
What is that?
It's a runtime. It's open source runtime that runs on top of NVIDIA chips. It's developed by NVIDIA. Even VLM and SGLang, which are 2 other open source frameworks, are native to NVIDIA, and so the ability to just move very, very fast is the thing we are optimizing for, and that's what NVIDIA is really good at today.
Gotcha. Okay, so a fairly one-sided play there for now.
Yeah.
With hopes for optimistic future. Maybe a layer above that, Tuhin, talk about this map a little bit.
Yeah.
You're working with so many different
clouds. Yeah.
Clouds. Some of these have even announced an inference platform of their own.
Yeah.
There's no reason for others to not do so. Maybe talk about that. Like, it seems to us through the class, a lot of speakers have told us that compute is very scarce.
Yeah.
Probably true. How are you getting your compute, and what's the strategy going forward?
Yeah, look, we work on top of 18 clouds. I think it's 20 now, actually. We have 87 different clusters where we're stitching compute together. This is the core, I'd say, piece of technology that we have, is that we have the ability to take a bunch of different GPUs from different places and stitch it together in one place and make GPU fungible in that way. The reason we do this is twofold. One, it's access. It gives, it is very, very hard to find GPUs. And if you add a constraint around which clouds they operate in, that makes it even harder. And so what we do is that we take GPUs from anywhere we can, stitch them together and abstract that away out from the customers. As to the first thing, and that's a core part of the strategy, and we'll continue to do that. We'll rent and we will own.
We will rent versus own.
Yeah, for the most part, but we will also build our own ownership.
Okay, we'll come to this in a bit. Yeah. Keep going.
But in terms of why, them going after and a lot of those platforms having their own inference things, it makes sense. There's a lot of value in that stack, in that inference stack that sits on top of GPUs. We welcome it. We will partner with our competitors. We're fine with that. We stand behind the value that we are providing. But it makes sense. Inference is very, very sticky.
Got it.
I think truly, like, a lot of people think that inference is a commodity. I mean, you've obviously studied these markets.
Yeah.
It just resembles the way that people used to buy databases.
Yeah.
To some extent, you choose once and you kind of just grow there.
Yeah. Well, it's also, just was with one of the great founders you had listed on here this morning. They said that inference is so sticky for us because ultimately this is the product that we deliver to our customers.
Yeah.
We don't want any disruption in the core service that our customers are consuming. A disruption in that is actually, it sometimes even the biggest cost line item, even more than their cloud spend, is the inference, the intelligence.
Yeah.
So I imagine it's a prize as large will be fiercely competed for.
100%. And I think it is, once you're in token path, like if your inference is down, your product's down.
Yeah.
You don't want to mess with that.
Yeah. I put a bookmark on renting versus owning.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that? We've had Chase from Crusoe here who talked us through the whole economics of building a data center, of owning the whole thing. You have taken the other side of it, which is to rent the...
Till now, yeah.
For now.
Yeah.
Okay, for now.
Yeah.
Talk more about that. It seems like an important decision and very different shape of the business.
Yeah, well, for our thesis was, to some extent, what is the sticky part of the stack, right? And so we would say that software is the sticky part of the stack here. I think what a lot of these clouds who are competing with us would say is that access to GPUs is the sticky part of the stack. And once you have that, the software part is easy. I think it's probably arrogant both ways. I think they're slightly arrogant to think the software piece they could do it very easily. I think we are 100% arrogant to be like, oh, we can do that too. To some extent, like we did that for speed, and we did that because we had no business building data centers. For us going forward, though, is becoming clear that what I would say is that no matter how much people tell you that there's a supply problem, it is 10 times worse. I think you saw in the Google earnings, they had the GCP. Did you see this chart?
Yeah.
I think they've got like a 10x backlog or something.
Yeah.
If you go out right now saying you want 1,000 GPUs, truly you're probably saying people are talking about Q2 next year.
Q2 next year, so 12 months out, maybe 15 months out.
15 months out. We have a cluster, a small cluster relative now. At the time it was big, in one of these clouds, that of B200s, Blackwell chips, B200s, like great chip. It's a bit old, but still it's an amazing chip. Our unit price right now is $263 an hour for that, and like it doesn't matter what that is because I'll just the relative piece of it matters more. That's up for renewal in October, and they came to us already in May and said 510 is the new price.
Wow. For
next year. Double. This is fine.
Are you going to take it?
No, absolutely not. That's egregious. And we have a bunch of other clouds that we can work with here. I think though, like what is becoming very important is that There's a slide that was doing the rounds on Twitter. There was a slide that was doing the rounds on Twitter of Noam Brown from OpenAI, who I think is close to the Altimeter folks as well. He came up with the O3 model, and the slide basically said that access to compute is the strategic advantage for inference. That's becoming clear for us. Is that look, we run in right now. I think the Baseten inference service across all our customers is bigger than the OpenAI API, is bigger than Gemini.
Wow.
In terms of how many tokens it does. So we do around 30 trillion tokens a day.
The Baseten inference service is bigger than OpenAI's API service. So
not ChatGPT, the API product.
Their API product. Okay.
Yeah, at least in last report. And it's definitely bigger than the Gemini thing. And so if you project that out, we'll need around 150,000 B200 equivalents in 2 years from now. That's just an insane amount of compute.
Could you translate that in dollars for the class?
Yeah. So it's about $7 billion of compute spend.
Easy.
$7 billion of compute spend. Too big. It's a scary amount.
Yeah.
The idea that we're going to be able to get access to that by renting is probably, it's probably not going to happen. And the only way we can guarantee that is knowing that we have a strong relationship with the chip providers and we can go buy them and put it up ourselves. And that's the reason we'll do it, is access to be able to fulfill the demand that we have for inference. And there's also an economic advantage to do it. It's about 30% cheaper. Like, of course, I think if you think about a scaled out cloud like Oracle, it's like 30% gross margins.
Yeah.
So it's about 30% cheaper to do that.
Yeah. Vertical integration. Yeah. Fascinating. So the shape of the business is going to change quite a bit over time. Yeah. But you want to own your destiny.
There's no other way.
Yeah.
Like, if you think about like what are the now I'll give you the third risk, but I'll tell them there's the three risks, right? Which is like open source, the app layer, and don't have access to enough compute. And that's the core risk of the business. And like, if we don't take care of that, we'll be in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, makes sense. That makes sense. Actually, follow up to the question you said, this 263 per hour renewing at 510 seems egregious. Yeah. Where did you settle at?
Oh yeah, we haven't responded yet.
Okay.
It's in September. We don't need to go to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, the question behind the question is, when should we expect the compute scarcity to get back to normal? Is this like a 12, 15 month thing? Is it a multi-year thing? Is it a multi-decade thing? Like, what's your best? I'm sure you guys have done some thinking or economic modeling around this.
I'm curious what you guys think. I'm curious what your public people say about this. I don't think it's ever going to normalize.
Yeah.
I think it's what you said earlier. It's like if inference demand is 1 billion x what it is today, like two different things are happening, right? Which is these applications are getting more agentic, and models are getting bigger. Which both of those things say there's going to be a lot more inference, which just means there's going to be a ton more compute. Yeah. I think the analogy really is like when you show up at JFK at 5 a.m. every day, there's no line, you go straight through. But by 8 a.m. there's a line out the door. Yeah. And we're out the door right now, but unlike JFK, which closes down from like 11 p.m. to 4 a.m., we don't have any reset period. Yeah. And so it just keeps compounding. Yeah. Actually, that's an interesting analogy. Does the inference demand die down between midnight and 4 a.m. and are you able to reuse that somehow? Well, but what is it like when it's afternoon somewhere else? I mean, there's like the thing, right? It's 5 o'clock. It's beer o'clock somewhere. It's like you can justify drinking a beer at any time because it's 5 p.m. somewhere. Got it. And I think that's the same thing with inference, where it's like even if demand here is down, in Europe it goes up, in China it goes up. Yeah. Makes sense. I'm gonna shift gears a little bit. One of the biggest things we've been discussing in class, a lot of the students here will go on to build businesses, start businesses, work at businesses. Yeah. If you were not building Baseten right now, what's your next best idea? What would you go start? What would you go build? That's a good question. Like I'd be going more the Crusoe route, to be honest. I'd be going and investing in energy and power. And I think the build out is like, we're just going to need so much space to put this compute. what I think like one of the ideas I'm most excited about, which I hope someone does, maybe someone here will do, is, you know, I was driving over from Oakland to San Francisco the other day, and you always see the ports there, and you see the containers there. So you start like containers are one of the biggest economic drivers in history because they normalize the unit of trade. And so, you know, my idea, like one of the things I'm really excited about is modular data centers.
Modular data centers,
which is like and standardize the unit of compute. Because whoever standardizes units of compute now we can just really industrialize. Like if you go and talk to all the folks who are putting up data centers right now and the people who own this powered space, everything is different. So to the extent that you can you can modularize the
and have a shared consistent format.
You're creating an API for compute, and then like a whole industry will start around that. Yeah. Because then you can have, you know, the same people servicing these things all over, and, you know, you create, and, you know, that's probably what I'd be working on.
Fascinating. Well, I'm sure folks have taken that note down. Relatedly, outside of that, is there a, you know, we play this long short game with every speaker. Is there a business? Is there a startup? Is there a founder that you're particularly excited about right now, and the other way, what you think is more hyped than they deserve?
I'd rather not play that one, but, you know, for the former, look, I think, you know, all the things I said, right? But yeah, no, like I think, you know, the whole any part of the build out.
Yeah.
And then, you know, in terms of short, look, I think I'd be looking at companies that just aren't innovating. I actually think the enterprises are fine.
Enterprises are
fine. Like, but I think they need to figure out how to take the thing that is unique to them, and post-train models and go do inference on them. But I think the ones that aren't doing that, like, I'd be very, very scared about.
Yeah. A lot of students right now thinking about what to study, particularly those who are starting their educational journey. What advice would you have for folks? It feels like quicksand right now.
Yeah, I actually think you should just study whatever. That's fine. Like, you know, they're like, you know, it's I think, you know.
Yeah, you change careers.
You know, and like, you know, you could become an expert in anything in 6 months. So just do the thing that's fun. You know, like I don't. Yeah. But I think in terms of like, you know, if you are, you know, like actually financing models of you know, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about, you know, how to finance data centers right now.
Okay.
Just you know, it's something I'm going deep on, and, you know, I think, you know, the project financing stuff is actually pretty, you get pretty nifty there, and so something to study.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, we'll open it up for questions. We've got 5 more minutes. Go ahead.
On the topic, what's your take on like the compute futures?
Oh, I don't know. Like, it's obviously interesting. I think the market is way too if you when like saw how compute deals are done, it's basically a drug market. Like, truly, it's like you have a guy.
Who's your guy?
We have so many guys, you know. And like, there's a guy in our office who kind of just sits in the corner, and he just calls people all day, asking for compute. It's Ed. Yeah. And it's absolutely terrifying. So like, I'm very bullish. Like, there's clearly going to be markets here, but I don't think the market has the, you know, it's like it looks more akin to, you know, it's not a mature market. I think a good way to think about it is like electricity markets are.
It's not as efficient. You're saying. There's a lot of slippage.
Yeah, there's a lot of slippage. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So Baseten's thesis is that compute and inference will go like 10,000x.
Yeah.
So what's the bear case, and what's the antithesis of Baseten?
Yeah, I said that, right? The antithesis is that there's only 2 people who can get compute in the world, and they own everything. That's you know, that's one. The second one is that, you know, we are dependent on open source models getting very good. And, you know, there's not enough open source models. That's number 2. And 3 is that, you know, if you truly believe in like the AGI thesis, you know, and you just play it out and you keep pushing and pushing and pushing, like we all have nothing to do. But then I would argue maybe inference is the only market left.
That's right.
Is the only market left. And
That's right.
yeah.
That's right. Go ahead.
Everyone seems to think, everybody talks about how important open source is, but we're not really funding it in the United States. Well, everyone except Anthropic. We're not really funding it in the United States. Do you think, given the national security implications, that there's a role for the US government, or how can we create artificial incentives for private sector open source?
Yeah, definitely. I think like the U.S. government, I think it already is getting involved in thinking about these things. I would argue that actually, like, when you go look at NVIDIA, when you go look at Microsoft and Google, they're actually putting a lot of work behind open source. I just don't think we've seen the fruit, like it hasn't borne fruits just yet, and it will come. So I think like actually there is quite a lot of investment, but we're just not seeing it. And I think the government is getting involved. But yeah, definitely, I think you have to create artificial incentives, and there'll have to be a alliance and for all these things to be incentivized top down. Yeah.
You saw the other side happen 2 days ago. The Chinese government invested in DeepSeek.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
What's to stop Anthropic and OpenAI from open sourcing one of their lagging but still quite good models, and then providing a workforce to both train on all of the high distribution data in enterprises? Are they still focused on research? And why can't they do that?
OpenAI already does.
They do that to some extent, but in a lot of ways, like it's for them to invest in post training to some extent. It's to almost give up on their what they think the thesis is, right? It's like, one of the most fascinating things about OpenAI and Anthropic is, if the thesis is AGI is everything, then why do they do anything at all? They should, every dollar should go to pre-training.
Yeah.
And so, but, they already do that to some extent, but their incentive to push dollars towards that is never going to be the case, because the reason why, like, all these models exist so they can just make the most money on the most expensive model. Like they want to push the capability gap, the capability argument as much as possible.
All right, go ahead. One final question.
About the idea of the modularized data center.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just wondering what would be the difference between that and like virtual machine.
The question is, what's the difference between a modular data center and a virtual machine?
Yeah. That's a good question. Well, I think, the virtual machine sits a couple layers higher up in the stack. I'm just trying to figure out, like, how do you make it cheaper to put up more compute? And so that, that's in a lot of ways, you're kind of saying like modular containers. You're kind of talking about containers, which is once the compute exists, you need that. And it kind of is that, just two layers deeper.
Yeah, it's at a different layer of abstraction.
Yeah.
I'll take one more. Was there one here? Go ahead.
Thanks for telling. I'm just curious what you think about where do you root from? Is it the stack or more optimization? Kernel, networking?
Yeah.
And
It's everywhere. Like Disag's the obvious one because you're really separating out concerns. The kernel stuff is continuing like a big, like the amount of people at NVIDIA and even Stanford, I think, who work on like stuff like Thunder Kittens and things like that. There's a lot of opportunity there. But the entire stack is changing. Like that's like the most fascinating thing about this market is that everything is like quicksand. Like you throw everything away. Like Ilya might come out with a new architecture for a model, and everything is up for grabs again.
Ilya?
Srivastava, yeah.
Yeah. Do you know what he's working on?
I mean, I have a sense, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was all about it. All right. Yeah. Perfect. Well, thank you so much. This was fun.
Yeah.
Appreciate you making
Thank
time.
you.